Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the NRW. I'm your host today, Rob Medina, and I thank you all very much for joining me here today because today I'm going to be reviewing the movie Punisher Warzone. Now, I actually intended on doing a review for this film last year in time around the film's anniversary because this movie came out back in December 5th of 2008, and I was intending on doing around December, but it just got a little too hectic for my schedule at that time, so I figured that I'll probably postpone it for later this year. But then considering that we had received news that Ray Stevenson, who played the Punisher in this film, had passed away this week, at least as of this recording, I thought it'd be a good time for me to talk about the film because there's a lot of great things about this movie that I really did enjoy, which I'll get into this a little bit here as well. But also because I want to just pay tribute to the man himself and Mr. Ray Stevenson, who, in my opinion, and I love Johnny Bernthal. Johnny Bernthal is phenomenal as a Punisher. And I actually said it in my social media post as well, too, that Ray Stevenson is my favorite Punisher on the big screen. But in reality, he is my favorite Punisher, period, which I'll get into as for my reasons why. So, and as you can tell right here, I have my Punisher shirt as well. And the Punisher is actually one of my favorite comic book characters of all time. In my top four, really, I have Batman, Judge Dredd, the Punisher, and then Garfield. But there's just so much about this movie that I really am excited to talk about here. But again, at the same time, I want to pay respects to the legend himself and Mr. Ray Stevenson, considering that, he had such a really prolific career. And it's been a lot of great movies as well, too. And some little unknown films here and there that he's been a part of here that I don't think a lot of people really know that he's been in that I think are really worth checking out. So apart from talking about the Punisher, I will be talking about Ray Stevenson for a little bit here as well, too, because there's just some things that you just can't deny. And Ray Stevens is one of those people, when you see him on the screen, that he is one of the best things about the films, whether or not the films are good, but he is good in the film. So without a doubt, there's just a lot I'm going to be talking about him in this movie, but just also about the film in general. So keep in mind that this is a tribute to him, but I will be talking about the Punisher Warzone because this movie, believe it or not, is actually one of my favorite comic book films of all time. It does have a lot of problems. There's no doubt about that, which I'll also get into a little bit as well, too. And I will be pointing out some spoilers here. So if you haven't seen the movie and don't want to be spoiled, so I recommend you guys pause the video, check out the film, rent it, buy it, come on back, and then we'll pick up from there. But otherwise, I will get into the plot synopsis, my positives, my negatives, and then my rating. Waging his one-man war on the world of organized crime, ruthless vigilante hero Frank Castle sets his sight on overeager mob boss Billy Rosati. After Rosati is left horribly disfigured by Castle, he sets it out for revenge under his new alias, Jigsaw. With the Punisher task force hot on his trail and the FBI unable to take Jigsaw in, Frank must stand up to the formidable army that Jigsaw has recruited before more of his evil deeds go unpunished. And that right there is the film in a nutshell. So now let's get into my positives. With my first positive, I will be talking about Ray Stevenson here, but I'm going to just say this real quickly about the movie in general, just to kind of start off here. I really do love this movie, and I will be the first to admit there is a lot of problems with this movie, and believe me, there are tons of problems with this film. But in the sense of that it's a fun movie for me, I will also point out too, which I'll be getting into my negatives, but I just kind of I want to preface this here, is that there are a lot of negatives that are with this movie that I do have major problems with. And even though for me, in terms of what the negatives are, they do outweigh the positives, but the enjoyment factor for me in this movie supersedes that by a long fucking mile. It's one of those very rare instances where I look at the film and I think there's just so many issues that I have with this movie. But the fact of the matter is that I always go back to this film and I just enjoy the living fuck out of it, because there's just a lot of great things about this movie that I really, really do enjoy that stick out for me. That I remember when I first showed this movie to my son a few years ago, because I kept telling him that I love this movie. This is my favorite Punisher film. This is my favorite Punisher period by Ray Stevenson. And I just thought he would enjoy the movie. I'll never forget one of the best authentic reactions I've ever seen in my life. And it may sound really subtle and not too exciting for most people, but for me it meant the world to me, because it was one of those things that I always look out for whenever I introduce someone to a movie they've never seen before, and just get a real raw reaction, and that reaction is what I live for. So when I asked my son after we had seen the movie, I'll never forget the face he made, and I swear this is true. It was as if though he got off the roller coaster and he was just like, that movie was intense. And I was just like, oh my God, this is exactly what I live for. I love that reaction. And my son, to this day, when I just asked him about this not too long ago, I think about a few months ago, if I recall correctly. I think around the time for when I was intending on doing the review for Punisher Warzone back in December of last year, I think I brought it up to him again, and I asked him, you liked the movie? He's like, yeah, it was actually pretty good. I was like, remember I said it was intense? He's like, oh yeah, that shit was. So it was one of those things where when I saw the movie, like, it solidified for one of the reasons why I enjoyed the film so much, because seeing that reaction from my son was one of the most exciting moments about the film. But it was also just the fact that you get to see the visualness that this movie does offer, because this movie does start off with a bang, and it's no pun intended. That movie definitely does start off raw, like really, really strong. And the violence in this movie is just, it's just out there. It's just, there are people getting arms ripped off, heads being sliced open, body parts being shredded to pieces. It's just an incredible amount of violence, which is what I loved about this movie, because I'm the type of guy that when it comes to more horror films, and especially when it comes to like really good action films that deal with this sort of, I guess, amount of violence, I want the violence to be visceral. I want it to be grotesque. I want it to be very raw, and I don't want it to hold back at all whatsoever. And this movie, to me, accomplishes that in all fronts there. So when it comes to the entertainment value of this movie, for me, it holds up very, very well. Even to this day, I still think that the movie does offer a fun factor about it, where it is over the top. There is no real reality to it other than the characters themselves, which I'll get into a little bit here. But when it comes to just the heightened reality of it here, I mean, this is basically what I enjoyed about the movie, is that the things that I want the Punisher to do in the film is exactly what I got with this movie. In fact, as much as I love Thomas Jane as the Punisher, I liked him as the Punisher, or I shouldn't say loved him. I said loved him. I meant to say liked him. I liked him a lot as the Punisher. But there's just certain things about the way that the character was handled that I remember at the time when I first saw the movie in theaters back in 2004, for when the Punisher came out with Thomas Jane. I loved the movie. And then when I saw it again over and over, and believe me, I saw that film religiously on a weekly basis, probably more than that actually. It probably was a daily basis if I'm not mistaken. But I remember as time had gone by, like my admiration for the film, although it's still very much here to this day, I should say. But I started to notice the qualities of the film, qualities about the movie that I thought that I didn't notice before, that I picked up on, quite frankly, after maybe like the 20th time that I saw the film, where I realized that the issues that I had with the movie were the way that how the character of the Punisher was actually used. Where in that film, the Punisher used the form of punishment by slowly breaking down the people that he was after. So creating a love triangle that in this case that John Travolta's Howard Saint's character believes to be happening. So he's breaking the man down before he takes him down, if that makes sense. So basically he took the Bane approach, whereas if you're reading Nightfall with the Batman comics, he's basically breaking him down bit by bit and then taking him out. It's an interesting concept. It's a very interesting approach, but for the character of the Punisher, I just didn't think it worked that well after watching the film more than 20 times at that point. And then I realized that what was missing for that movie wasn't necessarily the violence. It was just that visceralness that the Punisher had that we needed right away. And this movie does, in this case, the Punisher Warzone, offers that immediately. And I love that about it. And the other thing I also loved about this film too is that we're not really getting started with the origins of the Punisher. I mean, we definitely see this in this movie, but it's like barely a minute, if that. And you are pretty much starting off right where he's in the mix of this whole this vigilante approach he's taking on here. And the man that you see is pretty much the man that you get. And he's definitely not calling attention to himself, but he's the type of guy that is going out of his way to attack, and then ask questions later, which is one of the things about this movie that I really did appreciate, because there's a common characteristic about the Punisher, which is that he punches first and asks questions later. And by the time he needs to ask these questions about, whatever the situation was that he's trying to learn more about or investigate here, he's already killed the person that he needed to question, because he just started attacking them because they started coming after him, and he was not holding back to make sure that they get what they deserve as far as what's coming to them. So, there's in this movie, there's actually a scene where one mob member comes out, and the Punisher just kills a guy just like that without even hesitating. And then he comes to find out later on that he was actually an undercover agent for the FBI. And then he starts you can see that the remorse that he has for what the potential consequences are going to be for the man's family, which is dealt with in the film later on, which I actually did appreciate in that aspect of the story. We're seeing a much more human side to the character of Frank Castle, in this case the Punisher, as the story progresses along the way. But my overall enjoyment factor of this film is just that it's just a fun, violent shoot 'em out type of film. And there's no secret about what this movie is intending on being. So I just love the fact that it does take itself seriously, and I say that with quotes in terms of like what the story is about. But the antics that come with the overall story is over the top. But I just love that about the film. Now, going into the characters in themselves, we get the introduction for the first time on the big screen of Microchip, played by Wayne Knight, if I recall correctly. I think that's his name. I'm always fucking up everyone's names, but Wayne Knight, the guy from Newman from Seinfeld. This is actually the very first time we get to see that character in this capacity on the big screen. And as much as I loved him in the movie, because he is actually quite good in the film, he's not in that much, but when he's in the movie, he's definitely serving a very integral part. And the consequences of him helping out the Punisher as a way to raise the stakes, if you will, he does end up being the mice, which I actually thought was quite interesting. Now, I don't recall how it was in the comics. I actually haven't read the comics with Microchip in quite some time. But I will say that having that level of consequences in the film where you have someone that's, in this sense, I wouldn't say super close to Frank Castle, but someone that's very closely associated with him and understand how Castle behaves and understanding his routine, if you will, and someone that's very integral to Castle's overall mission, if you will. So I think that's something that's quite important to get that established pretty early on, and you get to see that they're far from perfect as far as like how the relationship is, but they have a mutual respect for one another, and they have a understanding of one another as well too, where in this case Microchip does not hesitate at all to challenge Frank whenever it needs to be brought to his attention about something that he's doing that needs to be handled, if you will. So I actually love the fact that Wayne Knight does bring that level of center, if you will, that's required for a story of this sort, because it does go crazy as far as the violence is concerned and everything else that comes with that. And having some really good actors to bring that level of gravitas does do a great deal of justice for what we're dealing with this overall story. Now, I will also point out too that Julie Benz, who is the wife of the FBI agent who is in this movie, I liked her character. But I guess I'm kind of going all over the place with this review, but I'm just going to start with this anyways. But I liked her character. I really did. Wasn't in love with her character, but one of the biggest problems I have with her character right now is the fact that her Brooklyn accent wasn't very good, in my opinion. So again, that's kind of going into the negatives here, but I just want to say that out right now, because as much as I did appreciate what the purpose of her character is, and it does serve a really great purpose for the overall story, which I'll get into a little bit here. But the fact that you have the character of the FBI agent who's in this case, who had passed away, and seeing the hardship that she's gonna be dealing with here with the loss of her husband, and then their daughter too, losing her father along the way as well. There's something about that aspect of the story that really is more or less kind of the heart and soul of the film to a degree, where Frank Castle is the type of guy that's just keeping to himself, but he's definitely a man on the mission who's out there to just bring people down. And there's a certain quality about him where a lot of people do respect him, be more or less as far as the authority figures are concerned, but on paper they have to make sure that he's got to be held accountable for his actions. And there are some officers out there, or agents rather, that are very much in agreement that we have to bring this guy down along with the mob as well too, despite the fact that Frank Castle is wiping them all out for us, but we can't have that happening here because we don't want to encourage that kind of behavior. But there are some other officers and people in the force as well that are wanting to help him with that, and some do along the way. And at the same time, you start to realize that there are some people in more or less those inner circles that are all working with Frank Castle in some way or shape or form that you learn as the story progresses here, which I thought was quite interesting. So you can see this is a man that has a lot of integrity, a lot of respect for some people in this force, but understands that there's a great deal of corruption as well too. So he's very, very keen on picking out who he can trust. And even though you don't get to see the background of how this all began, but just from what you can see in the film as far as the relationship with certain people that he meets up with and teams up with, if you will, you definitely get to see that there is a very well-earned trust. That's not something that Frank Castle, in this case the Punisher, will easily just hand out just to anybody. So I did appreciate that form of relationship when it comes to understanding Frank Castle as the man, or the man on the mission. But then when you get to see when he accidentally, well, in this case, when he kills the undercover agent, you can see that it just wrecks him. And that's something that I think where the film does take a really unique turn in terms of showing Frank Castle as the person, Frank Castle as the man that he really is deep down inside, who's someone who does not want to kill just anybody, but understand that this approach that he takes on it has more or less kind of like a blind side to him, where he's just full steam ahead, but doesn't understand the consequences, at least at that moment, of what effect it have on other people. In this case, as an undercover agent that has a family that are depending on him, counting on him, and love him, of course. And he just took that away from them. And he wants to make amends by leaving them a large sum of money to help compensate, to be able to survive, if you will. And even though the mother, or the ex, in this case, the widow, is not very welcoming of him, eventually she just starts to slowly warm up to him along the way. And what I also appreciate as well too is that something that's never a thing in The Punisher is that there is no relationship that's going to be developed as far as a romantic relationship is concerned, because that's always one thing about some of these films when you have these guys who are more or less loners, that there's always a hint of romance that's being offered to them as far as in the overall story is concerned. That's not quite necessary at all. And there was a little bit of hint of that I wouldn't say a hint of that, but I should say in an attempt to try that with The Punisher with Thomas Jane, which I didn't think was a bad thing to do at all, but it's just something that I just didn't think was necessary. So in this movie, there was never any sort of attempt for that or any hint of that Frank Castle wanted to be with her to try to basically have another family to replace the one that he's lost, if that makes any sense. So I actually did appreciate that sense of that part of the storytelling here too. And then when it comes to the villain in this movie, I'm going to say that I'm getting Dominic West from The Wire. He was also in 300 as well too, which is another comic book adaptation as well that he's also a part of. He plays Billy Rosati. I loved him as Jigsaw. That's the character that he plays in this movie too. I think that what he was able to do in this movie are just the very subtle things that I think make the character so much fun and really interesting at the same time. Like right away in the very beginning, when you get to introduce to this character, you can tell he's very much conceited, is very aware of his good looks. He's not a bad looking guy, Dominic West. And as he's trying to make sure he looks good before he gets into this meeting at this mansion that they're attending in the beginning of the film, one of his girls touches his hair and he just basically flips out on her and assaults her in a lot of ways to tell her, I don't touch you I don't tell you how to put on your makeup, so don't touch me and tell me how to look, how I look, or whatever the case was, whatever the wording was he used. So you can tell this is a guy that's not very nice with a lot of other people, but he is very well aware of his power, and he's definitely earned that power too, even though you don't actually see that in the film. But you can tell this is a guy who's risen through the ranks because he's a big earner, which in turn helped him to be able to be the asshole that he is, if not more. So I actually appreciate that we get that pre-established early on. And then as the story progresses along the way, when he more or less gets to when he changes it into Jigsaw, because he was thrown through this grinder that was full of glass and it just wrecks his face, and then going through this plastic surgery procedure to try to reconstruct his face to get back to his good looks, he realizes that that's something that's never going to come back at all. And then you get to see a vulnerability about this character, and just like that, he switches into more or less Jigsaw, a new person, if you will, even though he's still the same guy, where he is definitely the man that you could tell he really was deep down inside. But then now that the good looks are gone, it was all about protecting the look. Now that it's all gone, the visual, the violence that he's always had in him is just come out even further with what he had gone through, the courtesy of Frank Castle, aka the Punisher. So I really do think that when it comes to the villain in this movie, we definitely got a good one in Jigsaw. And this is the one thing about this film that I will say was far superior than what we got with the Punisher TV show, which I'll mention right now that the actor that played Bill Rosati in the show, nothing against him, nothing against what he has done, because he was actually quite good in the role. It was just the change of the character and how they were using him in that particular narrative for the Netflix original series that I had a problem with, even from the very beginning. Even though I loved the first season, second season I remember liking a lot, but then as time had gone by, my opinion about the second season has kind of changed a little bit, which I haven't gone back to watch since it first aired a couple years back. But I always had a problem with the way they were using the character of Bill Rosati, who did have a little bit of conceitedness about him, but then the idea of Jigsaw was kind of a metaphor where he had a slight scar in the second season after what had happened in the first one, which I thought was handled somewhat well when it came to how he got his face all kind of fucked up, but then he had surgery and all he has was a scar, which I thought was kind of stupid in my opinion. So the fact that they didn't hold back on letting the character of Jigsaw become Jigsaw in that capacity with the way he's meant to be I thought was handled quite beautifully. Now, as far as the overall action's concerned with this movie, I fucking loved it. There are some cool scenes, at least for my taste, that are just phenomenal. The shootout sequences, they might not be the greatest. I'll be the first to admit they're not the greatest I've ever seen, but it's just the fact that they just don't hold back at all when it comes to the amount of violence that's being presented in this movie, where the people are just getting shot left and right, body parts are being ripped apart from all the machinery and the explosions and whatever else. But at the same time, I appreciate that they're not willing to hold back when it came to that, and they just allowed for, in this case, the filmmakers and in this case the studio, say just go at it with that, because even though there was a lot of other problems with the film when it came to the behind the scenes stuff, but I did appreciate that they didn't hold back on the violence and it allowed to sink in the way that it does as the film progresses from there. Anything else I could point out here too? I mean, the overall narrative that we get with regards to Bill Rosati, who wants to get back at Frank Castle and getting the help of some other people that he's trying to recruit, which how that he goes about that I thought was quite well. It gets to show you that how good of a leader this guy is, how good of a speaker he is when it comes to getting people's attention and trying to and give them an incentive to fall with him, and using Frank Castle, the Punisher, as that incentive for a lot of these criminals out there that he knows they all want to get back at him, but they're all afraid of him because Frank Castle, being the one-man army that he is quite hard to track down and let alone defeat for that matter. So he's found a way to be able to find an opening by getting other people to come along with him and then send them off to kill Frank Castle. So it definitely becomes like a big escalated mission for Jigsaw in that sense, to bring the Punisher and kill him pretty much, and then it kind of just goes from there. So I do appreciate that side of the story there too. And anything else I can point out, I actually like the humor to this movie too. It's not the most funniest thing I've ever seen, but I appreciate the humor because it actually works in context of how the overall narrative works. If you read the Punisher comic books, I meant to say, they're not always the funniest, but they have some good moments here and there where the humor does land quite well. But I think they kept that consistent with this movie as well too, as far as how the humor works that I've gotten from the comic books as well. Otherwise, anything else I can think of right now? Well, I definitely will finish up with my pause by saying this here. Ray Stevenson. Now, believe it or not, this is not the first comic book character that Ray Stevenson had played. I'm sure a lot of people may know him from playing Volstagg in the Thor films, but he's also played another character by the name of Big Ray that is also a comic book adaptation for the movie called Accident Man, and there's also a sequel to that movie as well too, Accident Man, Hitman's Holiday. And then there's another movie too that I had almost forgotten about, that he had played a character in a G.I. Joe film, which a lot of people may not know, but if they do know, G.I. Joe is based on a comic book series, and he played the character of Firefly. So as far as I'm aware of right now, he's played 4 comic book characters: Big Ray, of course, the Punisher, Volstagg, and then of course Firefly. So this man is not a newbie when it comes to the comic book genre. This guy is a veteran when it comes to the amount of work he's done. He's done 4 different properties in terms of comic book films, for whether they be well-known properties or underground properties. But the fact is this man has been a part of the comic book genre films for quite some time. So I appreciate this man is fully immersed in that world, because in each of those respective roles that he plays, even though I wasn't the biggest fan of G.I. Joe Retaliation, I did like a lot of aspects about the film. I do certainly think it was better than the first G.I. Joe film, and it's certainly so much better than Snake Eyes, which I fucking hated that movie, but that's a whole conversation for another day. But I loved his character in G.I. Joe Retaliation. I actually thought he was quite good. So when it comes to his performance here as Frank Castle, this is the one thing that I will say that I loved about his performance too, is that it's not this, I love Jon Bernthal as an actor, and I loved him as a Punisher. I still think he's a great Punisher, but there's a certain huskiness about Jon Bernthal that definitely is oozing through his performance, which I do appreciate. Believe me, I really love his performance as the Punisher. But what I loved about Ray Stevenson, I meant to say, his performance as Frank Castle, as the Punisher, is that there's none of that huskiness about it. It's just this stoicness, this very stillness about him. But at any moment's notice, he's willing to attack, and he is the type of guy that you do not want to be on his bad side. And you always want to make sure that you are going to be someone that he can trust, because the moment he realizes he can't trust you, he'll take you out. And in what capacity that will be, I guess depends on the crime itself. But this is something that I always appreciate that Ray Stevenson had always done when it came to the balance of Frank Castle, the man, and then the Punisher. Because when it comes to the Punisher, he definitely does handle his business when it comes to the physical aspect of the Punisher, handling the gun scenes and handling the hand-to-hand combat. And there's even a behind-the-scenes footage as well, too, where you get to see how he's been training for that. And he definitely got in really good shape for that role as well, which I did appreciate as well, too, even though he doesn't have any shirtless scenes. But the point is that you can tell this is a guy that definitely knows how to handle his business when it comes to the physical aspect of what's required for this role. But at the same time, there's also that part of the character story that you are not seeing. You're not really getting the whole story to a degree, but you see the emotions that he's writing on his face when it comes to the hardships he's having to deal with here, and then when it comes to the heartbreaks as well too, and then when it comes to the pain he's causing to other people, innocent people for that matter, for his actions that he understands has great consequences. And you see that he's trying to make up for that by giving them something to understand that's not going to be solving all your problems, but I'm hoping that this will alleviate a lot of stress in terms of other areas that may be a factor to, that may be a struggle that may coming down the pipeline here. So there's a lot of those little nuances that I really did appreciate when it comes to his performance as the Punisher. And the look himself, I mean, the whole the get up for the Punisher in this movie, I loved it. It's still my favorite one that I've ever seen, outside of maybe what we saw with John Bernthal. But even then, when he was as the Punisher in the show, he didn't always have the suit on, which I shouldn't say this here, but I'm going to say it anyways. I wanted to see pretty much every episode, and the fact that we did not get it, instead we just got Frank Castle for the most part, I hated that. I'll be completely frank with you. I didn't hate his performance. I just hated the fact that we didn't see the suit on like I wanted to, like we got in this movie. So love that about this movie, and I love Ray Stevenson's performance, because Ray Stevens is one of those actors, in my opinion, that definitely does deliver no matter what the part is. There's some movies he's done, I recall seeing a few years back, that weren't necessarily the greatest movies at all, but his performance always stepped it up. And I always felt like he was one of those actors that no matter what the project is, he will always give it 110% no matter what. So in a way to close out my pause, I'm going to say that, in paying respects to Ray Stevenson, this is a guy that for a fact that when you see him on the screen, at least from my experiences, you always know that he's always going to be the guy that people will tend to remember the most when it comes to the films he's been a part of here. And there's quite a few he's been a part of in some landmark properties out there, landmark films, I should say, where people will recognize him when they see him, because they know that what he had delivered in those respective films, in the respective roles he took on, that he definitely did a really good job when it came to his performance there. So for me, that's going to be the end of my positives. Now let's get into my negatives. All right, so when it comes to my negatives, there's quite a few of them, but I'm going to start off with one thing. The character of Looney Bin Jim, who is a made-up character for this movie that is the brother to Jigsaw, Billy Rosati. I did not like the character at all. I'm not going to say I hated the character. I didn't like the character because the way that the character was used in this movie, to me, it clearly indicated that this character was meant to be like an add-on to help flesh out certain parts of the story to get from one beat to the next. And the problem that I had with this character wasn't the fact that the character wasn't any good, because if you look at it on paper, it's actually a pretty fun character, but it just wasn't really necessary one, I would say, because you already have a crew in Rosati's team, if you will, where you could already have one guy that's already like that on the team already, that doesn't have to be his brother. Because the fact that you have these two other guys outside of the agent that were part of his inner circle, as much as they were, I wouldn't say that they were useless, because they weren't useless. They definitely did serve a purpose, but they could have been much more effective if you just remove Looney Bin Jim, even though in the film he hates to be referred to that way, but for the sake of the review, that's how I'm going to refer to him. I just didn't think the character was necessary at all. Again, this is not a slight on the actor, because the actor did a good job, whose name escapes him right now, but I will say that as much as I did not like the character, it just had nothing to do with the character himself. It was just the fact that he was just an unnecessary add-on for the overall story. He could have been like a wild card where we're going to bring this one guy out and, let him loose on Frank Castle, who maybe was like a mafia associate that really wanted to be part of the crew, and they kept pushing him out. I could see him be something to that effect, and then brought in later on to more or less earn his stripes, if you will, and see that, that could have been done effectively if done correctly, of course. But as far as him being introduced as a brother, I just didn't think it was necessary. I never was always a big fan of having certain characters introduced that were not necessarily part of the overall narrative from the previous mediums, if you will, that are just added on for the story that don't really make much sense. And this is one of the situations that wasn't necessary, at least in my opinion. The other thing I will also point out too is that as much as I did enjoy the film, and believe me, I do enjoy this movie, one of the major issues that I have with the film was the fact that there were a lot of other characters as well too that I understand why they were there in the first place when it comes to how they were used in the overall narrative, and they did definitely serve a purpose. But I'm not going to go into all of them here. But I will say there's one particular agent who was transferred from one department to another as a punishment to take on take down Frank Castle, and he's the guy that is, I'm going to follow things by the book, even though he got in trouble for something else and was pretty much demoted. And that's going to be the guy that is going to want to go after Frank Castle to bring him in. And then eventually he slowly changes his mind as he starts to understand the full mission of what Frank Castle is all about. And although I did appreciate that, and it was definitely necessary to a degree, I always feel like there's another way around a character of this sort that's not required for you to bring him in that capacity, to bring him in as a guy that's going to want to take down the Punisher in that sense, because I always feel like that whenever you have a character of that sort that is more or less like the wedge between, the hero and the villains, if you will, it takes away too much time from other things that we probably could have been focusing on that I felt like was not necessary to be put in there in the first place, especially like the character Looney Bean Jim. That's a wedge in the story that was completely necessary in my opinion. But again, this is not a slight on the actors at all. It's just something it's just a personal preference for me personally. But otherwise, as far as everything else is concerned, some of the humor is kind of, or I should say, some of the characters that are introduced are definitely over the top. I wouldn't say they took me out of the film, but it certainly became almost cartoonish in a lot of ways. But when you read the comic book, the Punisher comic books, there are quite a few of these characters that are like that for some reason, to some extent, the way that they're used in this particular film didn't always translate that well for me personally. Although I'm sure there are some people out there who love all these characters and don't have a single problem with it. So it is all subjective at the end of the day. But for me personally, I feel like they're right in that fine line of making it too cartoony, where I felt like it didn't have to be that way, because you have a strong set of actors that do a really good job. Where Dominic West, who's playing Jigsaw, he offers that outlandish personality that I thought worked very well for this overall narrative. But then you have other characters that are similar like that, at least to a degree, that were just attacking onto that what I didn't feel like was necessary, because I felt like that if there's if there's got to be a sense of realism, let's not add too many goofy characters of that sort. And again, not to be dismissive about the other actors that are playing those goofy characters, but let's just add more realism in terms of the characters, and then have one guy that more or less kind of be that outlandish figure, because it works well for the overall narrative. So I always felt like there was a little too much of one thing that wasn't necessary when it came to the film. Anything else I can think of as well too? I'm gonna close this out, this negative out with my positive. But I will say though that a lot of the other actors that are pulling on Brooklyn accents, they do a pretty good job, I would say, when it came to their acts, with the exception of Julie Benz, who I felt like was the one that struggled with the most. And even though Frank Castle is from New York, he didn't have an accent. I didn't care personally. I just thought it was fine. It was Stevenson being able to pull off more or less a straightforward American accent. Although I do believe there was a slight attempt of a Brooklyn accent, but I don't recall. But the point I'm getting at is that I did appreciate the fact that when it came to the characters that are putting on a Brooklyn accent, even though the movie is all shot in Canada, I appreciated that. And a lot of the Canadian actors and British actors as well too put on these accents, did a really good job in my opinion. So overall though, even though I'm ending this negative portion of the review in more or less a positive here, that's going to be in my negatives. Now let's get into my rating. So as you already know, I love this movie. I think this movie is, as much as I said, there's a lot of issues that I have with the film, but it really is a work of art in my opinion. This is actually one of my top 10 favorite comic book movies of all time. I wouldn't say it's my top 5, but easily my top 10 for sure. Probably in the higher end of that, if you will. But I love this movie so much, and this is a film that I do frequent on a few times out of the year, maybe 3 or 4 times out of the year, because there's just so much about this movie that I really did enjoy, that I really take away from. But it really has to do with the actors in this film, for the most part, that do deliver a strong performance, considering the subject matter, considering the type of film that it is. But it's a bit of balance of, like, you have some really strong performances, a really great character moments, And then you have the outlandish stuff that comes with it as well too. I wish it balanced it out a little bit better, in my opinion, because this could have easily been one of those comic book films out there, like in the same way as Dread is, where people didn't see it in theaters and didn't do very well in the box office, but in the aftermath of all that, it certainly gained a strong following, where when people look at it now, like, this is a great movie. That's what I felt like The Punisher could have been, in that sense, where it's that small film that could, and the small film that should have done very well. But unfortunately, because the film didn't do very well in the box office and it wasn't very well received, obviously we never got a sequel. But this would have been the film that I would have loved to have seen a sequel, and getting characters like Barracuda, just to name a few. So it's an unfortunate event that occurred that we never got that sequel, but I'm glad we got this movie, because Ray Stevenson, in my opinion, is the best Punisher we've ever got. And I'm not saying that because he passed away. He's always been my favorite ever since I saw this movie. And he was always, in my opinion, better than John Bernthal. And I love John Bernthal. Believe me, I think he's great as a Punisher. But there were elements about the way the show had handled his character to a degree that bothered me. But the way it was handled here with his character, I loved it. So for me, this movie is a solid cheers. And those are my thoughts on the film. And I also want to point out real quickly, I want to give a big shout out to my wife who got me this Frank Castle Punisher standee a couple of years ago. I've had this guy back here for my reviews and interviews I've done for the last almost 2 years, I would say. And one of my favorite standees I have here at the house that she's gifted out of, I don't know how many she's gifted me here, but love this one so much that I had asked her just leave it back there for me, because Frank Castle is easily one of my favorite comic book characters of all time. I love this character. As you can tell right here, I'm a huge fan here. So I would love to hear you guys' thoughts in the comment section down below if you've seen the movie. And also, if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the NRW. Make sure you guys share, like our videos, and hit the notification bell while you're down there as well. And if you haven't done so, I highly recommend you guys check out NRW on social media. On Instagram, New Release Wednesdays. On Facebook, Nerds Rule the World. And on Twitter at the NRW. You can follow me on my social media accounts. On Instagram, You're So Cool with Rob Medina. On Facebook, Rob Medina. And also on Twitter, You're So Cool WRM. And that'll be it for this week, guys. I hope you guys enjoy this review. And until next time, stay safe out there and cheers.